When do we start the ritual? Patience, we will begin once the high priest arrives. But... Hush, young one, I know that you are eager, but we must not question the high priest. We must assemble as many offerings as we can before the deadline. I understand. Two men spoke to each other, ignoring the moans of discomfort coming from the nearby cells. A lone creature hid behind a pile of rubble, watching them converse in words she didn't understand. Her insect-like eyes and antennae peeked out slightly, fixed on the iron helmet one of the men held. It would be better to bring Rusty's head back to his body, but perhaps it might be better to wait it out. A black orb of faint light talked to the ant that was there, its voice sounding unnervingly calm, as though a burden was savoring the craziness of it all. Gleam, however, felt no such enjoyment. Her gaze darted between Rusty's helmet and the ominous figures before her. She was well aware of her limits, her mana reserves were practically depleted, and in her current state, any spell casting would likely draw attention. But waiting too long could spell disaster for Rusty. Omega! She chittered softly, her antennae quivering with frustration. She wanted to charge forward, snatch the helmet, and scurry off, but she knew she'd have no way to escape undetected. Hold your ground, my dear Gleam, let those fools chat away and your mana recharge, Rusty will be fine. Remember, at any time he can access one of his loadouts. Oh, but I suppose you weren't there when he attained that skill. A burden murmured as he tried to keep Gleam from doing something stupid. In his mind, she was still just a child and children were prone to emotional outbursts. It was best if she remained hidden and only moved when a chance presented itself. They'll leave it unattended eventually. These kinds of rituals are often theatrical. You'll have your chance, and if not, then there are probably ways to shift their attention. His spherical form turned toward one of the holding cells. Most of the people inside were half dead, but a few looked like they might cause trouble for the guards. If they managed to set these captives free, the ensuing chaos could provide enough distraction to slip past unnoticed. However, this approach was risky, they lacked crucial information about their enemies. Dozens of guards could potentially arrive to block their escape. For now, it seemed wiser to remain hidden and find a way to sneak out without raising an alarm. Gleam's antennae twitched in agreement as they decided to wait. Hidden behind the rubble, her gaze stayed fixed on Rusty's helmet. She watched as the two men eventually ended their conversation and moved into a different corridor, which she cautiously followed. She stuck to the shadows, though her body reflected a bit of the torchlight here and there. Luckily, only a few prisoners noticed her movements, and their shouts and questions went ignored by the guards. In the next chamber, Gleam spotted a raised altar smeared with dried blood and littered with body parts from humans and other beings. The man with a particular fondness for Rusty's helmet set it aside on a table near the altar. The two men then turned to face a grotesque amalgamation of body parts sewn together in a twisted form. They began chanting in a language Gleam couldn't understand, but she sensed this might be her chance to snatch Rusty's helmet and make a quick escape while they were distracted. Blood and guts. This is truly a cult of some evil god. Could it be the Lord of Torture and Despair Skuldar? Those do seem like his runes. Commented a burden while Gleam's mandibles clicked impatiently, signaling her increased feeling of dread at the sight of the bloodied patchwork. She could feel her mana trickling back at a frustratingly slow pace, each precious drop of magical energy like a lifeline she could barely grasp. Her gaze never left Rusty's helmet as it lay, unattended and tantalizingly close, on the table by the altar. The dark, throaty murmurs of the cultists filled the chamber, their voices blending with an unsettling echo that seemed to rattle the walls. Every instinct in her tiny body screamed to move now, grab the helmet and flee before things escalated further. Patience, little one, let your mana come back and then we strike, the time is almost there. Luckily, a burden was there to dissuade her from rushing in. Instead, she took a few steps back, retreating from the chamber. She waited for a few minutes as the men continued their strange chanting, until she had enough MP to cast the silencing spell once again. It was now or never. She let the veil of soundlessness envelop her body once more and slipped back into the gory chamber. With her silencing spell activated, Gleam approached the table, every move measured to avoid detection. Rusty's helmet sat within reach now, its dull sheen reflecting the flickering torchlight around the room. The chanting of the cultists grew louder, their voices rising in a rhythmic, ominous crescendo. A burdened spectral form floated beside her, urging her to stay calm and focused as she crept toward the helmet. Careful, Gleam. They're distracted, but if they sense us, it's over. Omega. Gleam's mandibles clicked softly in recognition. The sound around her was gone but her body was still visible. Her shiny silvery exoskeleton needed to avoid all the lights as it could reflect the light and alert the guards to her position. This was not an easy feat, but she was determined to save her friend. Her small ant legs skittered forward, going up the walls and even on top of the ceiling as she moved closer and closer to the table where Rusty was. But then, as fate would have it, one of the cultists paused in their chanting, his gaze shifting just as a faint glint of light bounced off Gleam's carapace. His eyes widened. "What was that?" he hissed, narrowing his gaze as he instantly turned around and scanned the room with his eyes. Degree. Gleam froze while on the ceiling. Some wind entered the chamber and blew on the torch, making the light hit her body. She quickly skittered into a darkened corner but could not move any more. The cultist took a cautious step forward as he attempted to see if there was an intruder there. "It's probably nothing. Come, brother, we must not stop the chance, or the high priest will punish us." "It was probably nothing, you are right as always." The cultist hesitated, casting one last glance around the dimly lit chamber before turning back to the ritual. Gleam remained perfectly still, her mandibles tightly clenched as her body pressed flat against the ceiling's dark crevices. She watched, breath held, as the men resumed their chant. The rhythmic sounds filled the room again, echoing through the stone chamber, and this was her cue to move. She seized this narrow window of distraction, slipping silently down the wall until she was positioned directly above the table where Rusty's helmet lay. With the help of her sound-concealing spell, she dropped down, her face now level with that of her long-lost friend. She hadn't existed in this world for very long and had nearly lost hope while captive among these strange humanoid creatures. But now that her dear friend had returned for her, she was determined to repay him by rescuing him when he needed it most. "Gleam, what are you doing here? You came to save me." Gleam nodded, extending her small, dexterous legs to brush against Rusty's cold surface. The helmet felt heavier than she remembered and looked slightly different, but she didn't care. Even with the added weight, it was manageable. She grasped him firmly with her forelimbs, lifting him into the air before scurrying off the table in a hurry. Holding her breath, she zigzagged through the shadows, carefully dodging patches of torchlight as she made her way out. "Hold steady, little one. We don't want to make any hasty moves now that we're so close." Aberdan commented as Gleam ran towards the exit, and Rusty quickly replied, his head bouncing around while being held up in the air. "Aberdan is with you? So it did actually work. Did you ever doubt me, my dear Rusty?" "Well, after they carried me off, I kind of did." Rusty answered Aberdan as he noticed his presence with Gleam. The ant kept her pace swift, darting along the shadows with Rusty in tow. Her loyalty outweighed her exhaustion, and every small step brought them closer to freedom. Eventually, they made their way out of this strange occult chamber and arrived back at the corridors. "Gleam, you're incredible. I was supposed to save you, but you saved me instead." Encouraged by Rusty's words of gratitude, Gleam's antennae gave a proud little twitch. Her silencing spell was still active, though just barely, and she knew she'd only have one final burst of speed before her reserves were fully depleted. They rounded the corner, and she moved as quickly as her insectoid legs could carry her. By the time they returned to the room with the captives, her spell had faded, but it didn't matter now. Rusty's body was already in one of the open cells among the other discarded prisoners, standing upright as though ready. She was surprised to see a pale human figure inside, though she recalled Aberdan's mention of this earlier, as it seemed this human form was now part of Rusty's new self. That was way too close. Rusty observed his body standing there, and now that Gleam had brought his helmet over, he could both see it and feel it once more. Though he could move his body without his head attached, his vision remained limited to what his helmet could see. His body pushed aside a few reeking cadavers, finally reaching out to take his head from Gleam's tired grip. He could tell she was exhausted as her MP was down to exactly 1 point. "You've worked hard, Gleam, now leave the rest to me." // "I'm glad to see you too." Once his head was back on his shoulders and securely attached, Rusty took a moment to assess his surroundings. The damp, cold air of the chamber pressed against him as he felt restored. His body shifted as he activated one of his loadouts to change him back into his regular Twilight form. Previously he had shifted the Albert armor into one with Twilight armor included, as he had been planning to use his darkness element from the start. Now he shifted back into his regular form, with no human body on the inside to hold him back. Gleam safely scurried up his arm to rest on his shoulder, and finally, the duo was truly reunited. "We aren't quite out of trouble yet, we need to get out of here in one piece. Did you perhaps spot any ways to move out of here or not?" "You didn't?" But there are many corridors here that we could use. Now that Rusty was back in his main body and equipped with a loadout, Albert's remains were safely stored in his inventory. They didn't need to use the main exit to get out of here. If Gleam found a corridor wide enough, she could carry his helmet out again. Alternatively, they could hide somewhere together while she dug an escape route. As he considered their options for getting out, Rusty noticed something intriguing. Someone familiar was here. Isn't that girl here again? This is the third time now, isn't it? It wasn't the halfling girl he had rescued before, but someone else he knew, Layla, the girl who had helped him kill his first human enemy. She had been part of the adventurer party that helped him during the exam. For some reason, she now found herself in one of the cells. Unlike the lifeless bodies scattered around, she was leaning weakly against one of the prison bars. Ah, now I remember. Before he could formulate a plan, a burden's voice interrupted him. Alexander was not with him at the moment as he couldn't have his bright, luminous form wriggling inside his body while these people were transporting him. It was good to know that he could give Gleam one of them to instruct her, but for now, Rusty needed to focus on whatever a burden was saying. You remember what? A way out? No, I remember where I saw that moon and scythe symbol. It was on the man who tried to attack this girl. I probably couldn't recall it as it was before the Soul Forge was fully activated. A burden proclaimed this revelation in a joyous tone, as if a great mystery had just been unraveled. This event had occurred even before Rusty's first evolution, but his memories remained linked with his guides. It seemed a burden had finally managed to rekindle the connection to those long-forgotten memories. It was. Indeed. Now it all makes sense. I bet the person who set off that trap in the dungeon was part of this cult. They even went to the trouble of bringing her here to finish her off. With this, the mystery is solved. I see, but does it matter? My good Rusty, I would be glad to explain to you the joys of making sense of mysteries, but I think we have more pressing matters at hand. Rusty's gaze shifted to Layla, who remained slumped, barely conscious, behind the bars. Her disheveled appearance spoke of days, if not weeks, of confinement. He could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, indicating she was still alive, though weakened. It seemed that she had been captured not long after they completed the adventurer examination. The significance of her presence in this cult's hideout was an enigma, but rescuing her might add another ally to their side. Gleam, perched on his shoulder, noticed his focused look and tilted her head curiously. "A friend? I'm not sure." Before he could make a decision, Gleam asked him a question about Layla. Rusty hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Gleam was his friend, but he didn't truly consider any of the humans in the city as allies. His presence here was temporary, driven solely by the mission to rescue his friend, and now that he had accomplished it, retreat seemed like the wisest choice. The identity of their potential enemies was uncertain, and perhaps leaving Layla behind was the safer, more logical option, a point that a burden also agreed on. The girl will only slow us down, we should get out of here while we have a chance. Oh. Gleam seemed confused by this situation, so he would need to decide. Would he help her out now and perhaps also set the other people free, or should he just sneak away while no one was looking? Strange chants echoed from a distant corridor, their rhythm interrupted by the clank of metal footsteps. Rusty was on the move, his metallic frame tensing as he shoved a few corpses out of his path and arrived in the middle of a dead-end corridor. Before him lay a row of closed cells, each apparently requiring a key to open. Inside, he could make out battered people, some chained to the walls, others curled up on the cold floor. "We don't have much time, Rusty. If you're going to decide, it has to be now, but in my lordly opinion, we should leave." Rusty hesitated, unsure how to proceed. A burden had always prioritized their survival above all else, a view Rusty largely agreed with. Yet he couldn't help but wonder if giving these people a chance might be the better option. He had no clear escape plan from this place, nor any idea how many cultists lay in wait below. Releasing the prisoners would certainly create a diversion, but it would be impossible without the keys. The bars, though rusty, were forged from an unfamiliar metal that resisted his attempts to store or manipulate it. He was a monster forged from metal, with the peculiar ability to store it. However, there were limits. One was that he couldn't store alloys or metals above his own grade. Since arriving in the city, he'd explored various smithies and shops selling all kinds of equipment. He had seen weapons made from strange materials, and after some research, he realized that metals, like monsters and adventurers, also had their own rankings. The bronze that formed his initial body was on the lower end, around F rank. Iron and even steel were a step above, at E rank. But there were metals with far superior properties, much like his own Twilight Iron, which was edging into D rank classification. As an E rank monster, he was unable to store any metals ranked above his own level, meaning that this rusty metal had to be at least D rank. Breaking it with his own strength or weapons would be challenging. To open those cells, he would need the keys, and he already knew where to find them. One of those cultists had a keychain on them. I could probably snatch it while they're chanting, but sneaking up on them would be best. Oh, you can help me sneak up on them. You've learned a silencing spell that will help me? Why, that's great, Gleam. But you don't have enough mana to cast it right now? Oh, that's fine, I still have some potions left. Rusty's satchel had been taken, along with all his belongings, during the scuffle with the mage. Fortunately, he still had access to his personal stash tab and storage system, where a few items remained. His supply of metal and items was running low as he had converted much of what he could into coins. This meant he would need to be cautious in the upcoming confrontation, as he could only heal himself a few more times. From his stash, he retrieved a small vial containing a vibrant blue liquid and carefully poured it over Gleam, aiming at her head. She chirped happily as her silvery body absorbed the restorative energies from the potion. Instantly, her MP began to rise, and she readied herself to cast her silencing spell. With a gentle wiggle of her antennae, Gleam cast a pale white light around him, extinguishing all sound in his immediate area. Ordinarily, his every movement was accompanied by metallic echoes, even after he'd gotten rid of all the rust. But with the spell active, there was nothing but silence. The spell reminded him of the mage he'd faced before arriving here. During that fight, he had realized just how vulnerable his otherwise sturdy body was to magical energies. When a fireball had struck his shield, he'd been stunned for several seconds, even though the shield had absorbed most of the impact. Something within the spell had disrupted the mana flowing through his body and his monster core. It seemed that living armors like him had a particular weakness to magical attacks, a fact he would need to remember in the future. If you're set on helping these lesser beings, perhaps it would be better to use your previous form. Aberdan suggested while making his way into Rusty's armor. Rusty replied, momentarily distracted. The dim light in the corridor kept him hidden from the prisoners, who hadn't yet noticed his presence. Aberdan halted him from venturing further, explaining his reasoning. While I don't support this plan of yours, if you're going to go through with it, there's a more effective way. Oh? Like what? Well, didn't you buy a few health potions? Yes, I did, I have a few in my storage. Excellent. Then we'll use them, but for that, it would be best to switch to your adventurer form. Ah, you're right. That would work much better. Rusty agreed, quickly catching on to Aberdan's plan. After stepping back, he switched to the loadout featuring the Twilight Iron version of his Albert armor. The human body was not within this one and he could still use all of his elemental skills. Aberdan clearly wanted him to heal some of the stronger prisoners before unleashing them on the cultists. If they were outnumbered, Rusty could make up for that by empowering these fighters, and maybe even one of the prisoners knew a way out of this place. It was, indeed, a far better strategy than the haphazard plan he'd been considering. Let's go then. Gleam clung to his shoulder as the two finally emerged from the shade. With the silencing spell active, they slipped through undetected. From the corner of his visor, Rusty spotted Layla, who still seemed dazed. For now, she'd have to wait as he needed to get the keys first. Quickly, he moved down the corridor toward the source of the strange chanting. The two cultists who had carried his body earlier were still there, engrossed in their ritual. They knelt before a grotesque patchwork of flesh, emitting an eerie screeching noise. The air in the room crackled with dark, vile energy that Rusty couldn't fully comprehend. But one thing was clear, the cultists were far too absorbed in their ritual to notice him standing there, bow drawn and arrow ready. He aimed at the first cultist and activated his skill, Power Shot. It enhanced the speed of the arrow, turning it slightly red as it flew towards the target. The silence spell cast by Gleam meant that even the release of his bowstring wouldn't alert the cultists, who were fully entranced by their ritual. The arrow pierced through the air, finding its mark in the back of one cultist's head with deadly accuracy. The force of the impact drove the cultist forward, impaling him against the twisted statue they were worshipping. A dark spray of blood erupted, coating the statue in a fresh crimson streak. The remaining cultist gasped, his chant cut short as he stumbled backward, eyes widening in horror as he saw his companion's lifeless body slumped against the altar. Before he could react, Rusty had already knocked a second arrow, ready to silence him too. Gleam's tiny antennae twitched in excitement as she watched Rusty let the second arrow fly. Regretfully, it was a bit short of the intended target and embedded itself into the man's shoulder with a sickening thud. The man cried out, clutching at the wound. The element of surprise was gone now, and he scrambled to reach the dagger at his belt. But Gleam was quicker. She extended her forelegs, her mandibles clicking as she summoned a mana bolt, hurling the crackling sphere of energy directly at the cultist. The spell collided with his chest, sending him staggering backward, his grasp on the dagger loosening. Seizing the moment, Rusty dashed forward, drawing his sword in a swift, fluid motion. The cultist barely had time to look up before Rusty plunged the blade straight through his chest, pinning him to the ground. The cultist gasped, his eyes wide with shock before he slumped over, lifeless. "Good work, Gleam. Did your casting speed increase? You didn't have much to do, so you tried to train your mana manipulation skills? That's great." Rusty praised his friend as he pulled his sword free. Gleam chirped softly in reply, her antennae twitching as she settled back on his shoulder. Rusty bent down to inspect the cultist's belt and quickly located the keychain they'd noticed earlier. He held it up, the metallic keys clinking softly in the silence. A burden materialized beside him, his black form inspecting the keys. "One of these must unlock the main exit. But there may be other doors we haven't seen yet." Rusty nodded and pocketed the keychain, then glanced at the bodies of the fallen cultists. Their blood was pooling around the monstrous statue, which, disturbingly, seemed to be absorbing it. He had never seen anything like it before, but instinctively felt it was best to pull them away from the statue. After dragging the bodies aside, he searched through their belongings and found a replacement spatial satchel similar to his old one. Inside, he discovered an assortment of strange items, dried bones, human hands, and other unsettling objects. Deciding to discard anything that might alarm the other races, he emptied the satchel of its grotesque contents, then attached it securely to his belt. "We can still turn around, Rusty. Are you sure you want to do this?" Rusty paused, considering his options. He had the keys and could try to escape alone. He still had a bit of mana left and a few potions, perhaps just enough to conceal himself in the shadows. The place was littered with bodies, rubble, and thick webs. This meant that it might be possible to find a hidden corner. However, he knew there were trackers more skilled than Gleam, so hiding carried a high risk. Eventually, someone would come across the cultists and search the area for him. Helping the others escape seemed like a safer bet. He could always abandon his body to hide away during the initial confrontation. Rusty was more worried about Gleam sticking out as a sore thumb, and perhaps having those people act as a distraction was the best option. Yes, some of them might know the way out and a few of them looked strong. "Don't come crying back to me when your plan backfired." "I won't. Now Gleam, remember to stick close to me, they will think that you are my tamed beast." The plan was set, and it was time to act. Rusty retraced his steps back to the prisoners and moved toward the cell where he'd spotted a few promising individuals. He instructed a burden to assess them and decide who should be prioritized. With only 3 low-quality healing potions, they needed to make each one count. "If we're choosing, then that woman over there is probably the best option. She seems to be a priest, so she might be able to heal more of these lesser beings. Then, that man looks to be the strongest of them all." To Rusty's surprise, the person a burden had singled out was in the same cell as his acquaintance. He pointed him towards 2 people, one a lady priest and the other a muscle-bound warrior. The man looked to be in terrible shape and bound by several layers of shackles. Rusty approached the cell, the keys clinking softly in his metallic grip. The prisoner's eyes widened as they noticed him, a hulking suit of darkened iron armor with a glimmering, insect-like creature perched on his shoulder. They stared in both hope and fear, unsure of his intentions. Gleam wiggled her antennae at them, the mana inside of her body emitting a gentle glow that eased their minds. The priestess, an elven woman with matted silver hair, leaned weakly against the wall. Despite her exhaustion, her gaze was sharp and alert. Beside her lay a tall, muscular human warrior, his body battered and bruised. Though unconscious, the raw abrasions on his wrists and ankles hinted at his attempts to break free from his bonds. Layla, the one familiar face in the cell, was slumped against the bars. As Rusty opened the door, she recognized him almost instantly. "That armor. Mr. Alb. ERT." Her voice was faint, and though her wounds were severe, she was alive. The young woman appeared delirious from her injuries, barely able to keep her head up. She was barely keeping her head straight, so for the time being, he decided to use the first potion on her. The other prisoners watched him warily, likely assuming he was part of the cult. With Layla's help, though, he could change that perception. If she vouched for him, he could more easily gain their trust, a suggestion Aberdan had wisely offered. "Yes, it's me, here, drink this." From his storage, he withdrew a vial of thick, shimmering red liquid and held it to her lips. Layla drank in small, labored gulps, the color returning to her cheeks as the potion took effect. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus her vision, and then gasped as her strength returned enough for her to sit up. Why are you here?" "I'll explain later, for now, we need more help." With Layla beginning to look steadier, he turned his attention to the priestess. Her eyes met his as he approached, narrowing slightly in appraisal. "Can you heal the others?" he asked, offering her the second potion. She nodded, though her voice was weak. "If I regain my strength, but my holy P power is. I also have a mana potion, this should be enough, right?" He uncorked the potion and carefully tilted it to her lips. She drank slowly, visibly relieved as the restorative liquid coursed through her. Once some of her injuries had been healed, he handed her a mana potion to help her restore some of that holy power she was speaking about. Her breathing steadied, and though she was still weakened, she had enough strength now to drink the other potion by herself. "Thank you," she said while Rusty moved over to the third person, the warrior lying on the floor. Rusty crouched down, prying open the warrior's mouth, and began carefully pouring the last potion down his throat. Just as the liquid touched his tongue, the warrior's eyes shot open. He lunged forward as if waiting for this opportunity, but was held back by the shackles still binding his hands. "You bast, hey!" The warrior coughed, coughing up some of the potion. His gaze darted around the room, taking in the priestess, Layla, and then Rusty, whose imposing armor was the last thing he expected to see. "Easy, friend, save that strength for those people that brought you here," Rusty responded while taking a step back to go through the keys. The man was confused, but he wasn't an enemy, and now that he had some help, it was time to conquer this underground dungeon filled with cultists. "What's going to happen to us? What if those people return? I want to go home." Rusty looked at the various people before him, beginning to wonder if helping them had been a mistake, especially given the priest's erratic behavior. After he had restored her health and provided her with mana potions, she went to work. But instead of healing the strongest fighters, she focused on the youngest and most frail among them. In Rusty's battle-ready mind, this didn't make sense, as they needed more capable soldiers on their side and not more liabilities. Fortunately, the strongest among them appeared to be the warrior Rusty had just healed. Despite his earlier weakened state, the warrior regained his strength faster than Rusty expected. The shackles that had bound him seemed to have unusual properties. Once they were removed, his health began to recover on its own, and his wounds closed with superhuman speed, even without further potions. This made Rusty wonder if he should keep those chains for himself. The only issue was that the chains were made from an unknown metal that his system wouldn't allow him to use directly. He could carry them in his stash tab, though that space was limited. Fortunately, the large spatial satchel he had found in the underground chamber was spacious enough to hold them. When the warrior tore the chains from the wall in a fit of rage, Rusty saw the potential for a hidden weapon, one he might wield in the future. Thus, while the others were helping everyone else, he stuffed one of the chains into the satchel. "Mr. Albert, you have my gratitude, but how are we going to leave this place? Do you know a way out?" Layla, his acquaintance from the Adventurers Guild, finally spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a mechanism that opens a stairway up, but I'm not sure how to activate it, or how many enemies we're facing," he replied, struggling to keep his composure. The people here were an unpredictable variable, one that could turn against him at any moment. If things got too chaotic, he was prepared to shift into his more slender form and make a quick escape. "I think we have two options, either we try to activate the mechanism and wait for it to form the stairs, or we..." Before he could finish, the large man he had healed with his potion cut in. In his hands a rock that he promptly crushed and threw the dust to the side. "Or we destroy their base and kill them all. Those bastards dared to deceive me, I'll slaughter every last one of them." The man's voice echoed through the chamber, his anger intensifying, much to Rusty's dismay. The last thing they needed was this much noise. Although going deeper into the underground cult lair might be beneficial, he was wary of the figure the cultists called the High Priest. Escaping using the existing mechanism seemed a safer option, but it would likely alert their enemies to their location. Please, calm yourself, they'll hear us. We have no idea how many there are. Let me tend to the wounded first. The lady priest called to the burly man, her voice barely a whisper. The warrior spun around, his eyes narrowing as if her plea had struck a nerve. His face twisted in fury, but he took a slow breath, struggling to rein in his anger. His gaze flicked to the mangled bodies scattered around, and eventually, he just nodded. He turned and began to move out of the cell, pausing at the door to look back. If anyone comes, you'll hear it. Make it quick. It seemed he intended to act as the lookout. He headed to the end of the corridor, but Rusty waved him down just before he could go on his way. What do you want? The man barked at him in an annoyed tone, but Rusty didn't react. There are some weapons there. Better than going empty-handed. Rusty replied, gesturing toward a darkened room filled with bodies. Before moving over to help, he'd placed some of his own weaponry there along with the daggers he took from the two cultists. They were probably inferior to what these people were used to, but still better than bare fists. The man nodded, moving toward the room. For a moment, he looked taken aback by the sheer number of corpses but quickly set about collecting a weapon. With an iron axe slung over his shoulder, he resumed his post at the corridor's end, ready to keep watch. Rusty returned to the other holding cell, where an unexpected scene was unfolding. Gleam. Rusty murmured, noticing his ant friend intently watching the elven lady as she channeled her healing spells. Gleam's antennae twitched with curiosity as she observed the priestess's energy manipulation. Rusty could tell she was doing something specific, trying to imitate the woman's movements and magic. Gleam hadn't often had the chance to witness different types of magic up close, and, to Rusty's surprise, there seemed to be more than just curiosity in her gaze. Oh, the young lady must have been busy while we were gone. Aberdan remarked, noticing before anyone else that Gleam was subtly mimicking the mana patterns of the spell, shaping them according to her own understanding. At first, Rusty wasn't sure what to make of it, but then he saw a new spell appear in Gleam's status window, one they could potentially use. Lesser Cure of Light. Spell. A variant of the Lesser Cure spell, attuned to the light element. That spell will be more potent than regular healing spells. Aberdan added, being the first to comment as he too noticed the new spell in Gleam's status screen. Rusty hadn't asked, but his demonic guide was quick to explain why this particular spell would be more powerful than standard healing magic. Normally priests use their healing spells by channeling divine energies from their deity, but Gleam here learned a more pure form of it, without relying on a divine being. Since it's attuned to her natural light element, it will heal quicker and potentially have better effects on higher undead. Rusty took in the information, and it made some sense to him. He'd seen priests use divine healing spells in the dungeon before, but his own light elemental skills seemed different, more efficient, using less mana and taking less time, yet with a stronger impact against undead monsters. It seemed that light was a more advanced form of healing. With Gleam's new spell, it might be wise to focus on undead creatures for quicker leveling, since she could likely use this cure as an offensive spell as well. Once we are finished here, you must let me teach our little lady some fundamentals. Sure, but first why don't we put her skill up to a test? Rusty marveled at Gleam's progress as the little creature was developing abilities faster than he'd thought possible. Without a second thought, he decided to put Gleam's newfound skill to the test. He approached Layla, whose strength was returning but who still winced with each movement. All right, Gleam, try using your spell on her. Rusty whispered, patting his ant companion lightly on the head. Gleam's antennae glowed softly, and she cast a faint, warm light over Layla. A soothing aura surrounded her, gently knitting her remaining wounds together and revitalizing her instantly. Her face went from pale and drawn to a more natural, healthy flush. This light, is that tamed creature doing this? Layla was surprised by the instant healing that allowed her to pick herself up from the ground. Rusty had decided to let Gleam test the spell on someone he could somewhat trust, and it was a success. However, there was a small problem. As soon as the spell finished, Gleam's body slumped, her insect legs trembling as her breaths came faster. She settled back onto Rusty's shoulder, looking more exhausted than before. That was impressive, Gleam, but let's save your strength. No more healing for now. Their name is Gleam? That's a cute name, thank you, Gleam. Layla added, with a warm smile and her hand trembling as if she wished to give the silvery insect a pat on the head. Gleam's expression brightened, clearly pleased to be praised by two people at once. Rusty made sure to speak loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, wanting to make it clear that this ant was a friend, not a foe. Now that they'd seen her heal a person, they would likely assume she was merely a tamed creature. We need to start moving. Layla nodded, moving beside Rusty as they made their way out. He filled her in on the weapons he had stashed, and after picking out one of the cultists' daggers and an iron bow, she looked ready to do some damage. While the elven healer stayed back to tend to the injured, Rusty and Layla moved toward the spot where their lookout was supposed to be stationed. Instead of keeping watch, however, the man had ventured in deeper and was now studying the stair mechanism. The door could be opened with the keys Rusty had taken from the fallen cultists, but there was one issue. I remember this, it was really loud. If we activate it, it'll definitely give away our position. Layla whispered, recalling her initial descent. Rusty nodded, knowing she was right. Activating the mechanism would likely draw unwanted attention, alerting enemies to their escape route. If they triggered it, they'd need to prepare for a fight, and one that could come from both sides. What are you two mumbling about? Spit it out! Growled the large man, clearly annoyed as he saw Rusty approach. It's about the way out. If we use this, we'll need to hold out for a while before the steps assemble. There are cultists above us who will try to block us as we ascend. And once we activate it... The man raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. He seemed unimpressed, possibly because he saw himself as the strongest among them and didn't care much for elaborate plans. Ah, I get it. Those bastards are busy praying to their shitty god and will come running the moment we activate this thing. Great. I've got a plan, then. Come with me, you two. He declared with a smirk, cracking his knuckles as he turned back toward the corridor where all the people were. Soon they were back to hatching a plan and it seemed that Rusty would be getting the short end of the stick. Listen up here you lot. Move your arses if you want to live. Anyone that can stand come with me. We need to move some things. Despite his gruff demeanor, the man turned out to be a surprisingly effective leader. His voice wasn't especially loud now, but it held a calm confidence that eased some of the tension in the group. Before long, people were moving with purpose, gathering whatever they could find, rocks, logs, and even the bodies of fallen cultists and stacking them in front of all entrances to the central hub area, creating makeshift barricades to slow down the approaching cultists. The plan was straightforward: Rusty, Layla, and the man would hold this position, preventing the cultists from breaking through, while the healer and those well enough to move ascended the exit route. Once everyone else had made it through, Rusty and the others would fall back. It was a simple strategy, though Rusty had hoped to join the first group heading up. But their temporary leader, perhaps recognizing Rusty's combat abilities, had decided he'd be more useful guarding the area. As they were finishing fortifying the room, suddenly some voices and steps echoed from the distance. Someone was approaching from one of the corridors and they didn't seem to be friendly. It was one of the cultists, holding a torch and moving towards their direction. He came to a stop before an entrance that was blocked by a pile of random furniture. What is the meaning of this? What's going on? Arghhh. Before he could continue speaking, an arrow flew through the air and connected with his forehead. It was shot by Layla and instantly the cultist slumped to the floor, his torch clattering to the ground and casting eerie shadows across the room. Layla lowered her bow, giving Rusty a quick nod, while the large man smirked approvingly at her deadly accuracy. The flickering torchlight illuminated the barricade of broken furniture and piled rubble, casting long shadows on the stone walls that seemed to twist and dance like spirits of the dead. There are more of them coming, this is it, get ready. Even before Rusty could activate his life detection skill, the warrior shouted. They're coming. His voice was sharp, signaling the healer to activate the stairs that led up behind them. The entire place began to rumble as she inserted one of the cultists' keys into a socket in the wall, while another person pulled a lever on the opposite side of the chamber, a lock impossible to open without at least two people. Shouts erupted from the other side as the cultists spotted their fallen comrades' bodies and rushed forward, realizing something had gone horribly wrong. Rusty quickly notched an arrow and took aim, his focus narrowing as he fired through one of the gaps in the barricade. The arrow flew true, striking one of the approaching cultists. Beside him, Layla did the same, her iron bow releasing an arrow with deadly precision. The battle had begun. The cultists charged, their footsteps a relentless drumbeat echoing through the corridors. Their voices echoed from the distance and melded together as they charged. There was a sort of fanatical unity in their approach as they continued to run at them and never stopped even after losing multiple members to arrows. The warrior stood at the center of their defensive line, waiting for the first cultist to breach the barricade. Gripping an iron axe with both hands, his expression was a mix of anticipation and rage. While Rusty and Layla held back the main corridor, two side entrances remained vulnerable, and enemies were already pushing through in an attempt to break in. Time was of the essence, and the stairs were slowly unfolding behind them. Many were still injured, barely able to walk, and the situation was growing dire. Rusty began to wonder if perhaps a burden had been right, that he should have taken a more covered approach rather than the plan that was now unfolding before them. How do the humans say it? Ah yes, shit. Intruders. Kill them all. For the slaughter. With the cultists bearing down on them and their backs literally against the wall, Rusty felt a tinge of regret. The barricade groaned under the force of the fanatical attackers pressing against it. Rusty braced himself, glancing back at the stair mechanism. He could hear the blocks shifting into place bit by bit, and he noticed some of the injured trying to move as the steps unfolded beneath them. He wasn't sure how long it would take for the entire path to form, which meant that every second counted. He tightened his grip on his bow, his fingers moving with practiced ease as he loosed another arrow. Cultists on the other side were dropping with choked screams, but their numbers kept growing. Layla, beside him, kept her composure, pulling arrow after arrow from her quiver. Meanwhile, the burly warrior at the center of their defensive line roared, cleaving down any cultist unlucky enough to break through one of the side entrances. He fought with a wild abandon that was almost terrifying to watch, cutting down enemies as if his fury alone fueled him. Considering their numbers, perhaps this plan would have been better, if we were going up the stairs instead. A burden muttered from within Rusty's armor. There were far more cultists than any of them had anticipated. It was clear that they would have likely been overwhelmed if they had attempted to push deeper into the lair. A small army of robed figures was advancing, and for every cultist they killed, two more seemed to take their place. Eventually, the cultists even began using the bodies of their fallen as shields, pushing forward and slamming against the barricades. Layla, keep shooting, here, use my arrows. Rusty handed her the rest of his arrows while sprinting to the side. This wasn't looking good. The barricade was close to breaking, and he could see cultists preparing to force their way through. Anticipating this, Rusty had set a halberd nearby for just this occasion, ready to wield it with his Polyrm passive. As he passed the arrows to Layla, she nodded in thanks and turned her focus back to the oncoming horde. Rusty lunged forward, driving his halberd into a cultist attempting to squeeze through a gap in the barricade. He thrust forward with his weapon, putting every ounce of strength into the blow and forcing the cultist backward. But as soon as he pushed one enemy back, another took its place, and the barricade began to give under the relentless assault. Behind him, the rumbling stairs continued to unfold, each stone block sliding into place with agonizing slowness. Time seemed to be slipping through his fingers, but he had no intention of giving up. The cultists moved like a mindless zombie horde, and though his light-based skills wouldn't work here, he had other options. After driving his Polyrm into one of the cultists and shoving with all his might, he managed to create a small gap in the barricade. Moving quickly, he reached into his new spatial satchel and pulled out a yellowish potion he had carefully prepared for emergencies like this. He flung it through the opening he'd created, and as it collided with one of the cultists on the other side, a massive burst of flames erupted, spreading outward and igniting the hooded figures nearby. Arghhhhh! The evil god worshippers started screaming as the flames roared to life, illuminating the corridor in a blinding blaze. The potion Rusty had thrown was a middle-grade blaze potion, meant for desperate situations. Cultists writhed in agony, their robes engulfed, some dropping to the floor in a futile attempt to smother the flames. The intense heat created a temporary barrier as the burning figures fell into one another, slowing the cultists' advance for precious moments. They are retreating. Rusty informed his allies as his potion ignited the main path, creating a wall of fire just as the alchemist had promised. Even if doused with water, the flames would keep burning for a solid few minutes. With the main path blocked, they could now focus on defending the two side passages, where the berserker warrior was holding his ground with fierce swings of his axe. Despite the temporary reprieve from Rusty's potion, the cultists pressed forward, relentless in their assault. The flames cast long, flickering shadows across the blood-spattered walls, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. As the cultists began to spill in from the side passages, the berserker warrior roared, cleaving down two with a single swing of his axe, and it seemed to be enough to stem the tide. Layla and Rusty, now focusing on the side passages, were able to help and push back the advancing madmen. Eventually, Rusty was even able to resemble some of the barricades back into place, holding back the enemies that were trying to enter through the narrower side paths. Things were looking well for this haphazardly thrown together party, but from within the main corridor, more trouble was approaching. They heard it, a deep, guttural chanting from somewhere within the cultists' ranks. The high priest emerged, his robes billowing like shadows, and in his hand, he wielded an ancient staff carved with runes that glowed an unnatural crimson. His eyes, dark as the void, swept across the burning corridor with calm, calculating malice. The priest raised his staff high, his voice booming with a harsh incantation. The flames from Rusty's potion seemed to flicker and warp as if affected by some unseen force. The cultists around him writhed in ecstasy as he chanted, and an unsettling energy pulsed outward, rolling over the barricades like a dark tide. Suddenly, the flames dimmed and died, leaving only smoldering embers in their wake. The high priest had somehow quelled the blaze, and with the last flicker of flame extinguished, he pointed his staff toward Rusty and his companions. "Enough games, bring the sacrifices back, the Lord of Blood demands it." The priest shouted, his voice dripping with disdain, and with a swift motion, slammed his staff to the ground. A crimson wave of energy surged forward, crashing into the barricades and blasting debris across the room. To make matters worse, the red energy that seeped from the spell enveloped the other cultists, triggering an eerie transformation. Despite their wounds, from cuts, arrows, or burns, they staggered to their feet once more. Their eyes turned cloudy, blood seeping from their sockets, and dark veins bulged across their skin as they advanced with unnatural vigor. The eerie transformation of the cultists sent a chill down Rusty's non-existent spine. Their bodies began mutating into grotesque, inhuman forms, covered in cancerous-looking lesions. Blood dripped from their open wounds, yet somehow they continued to move forward. The wounds seemed to pulse with a strange, crimson energy, as if it were sustaining them despite the damage. "That's a blood frenzy curse. We need to retreat. Those things are much worse than regular zombies." A burden warned Rusty and he took it to heart. It was clear that he was out of his league if he tried to face them head-on. The cursed cultists were in a state that defied reason, stumbling forward with twisted limbs and blood-seeped eyes, oblivious to pain or fear. Layla's face paled as she saw the horrific transformation, but she didn't falter. She raised her bow, and lodged one of her arrows right into one of those bloodshot eyes. To her surprise, the transformed cultist didn't even flinch, as if his body was unable to register the pain. Instead, he roared out in annoyance and started charging forward. The high priest remained in the back as if he was waiting for them to fall into despair, his dark eyes glinting with satisfaction as he watched the scene unfold. "We need to retreat. Gleam, do it now." Rusty wasn't about to die here. What time they had bought for the prisoners would have to be enough, as he needed to retreat to save himself. He'd learned long ago that a backup plan was essential, and he had too, an expensive incendiary potion and his partner. Although she had used up her magic energy earlier, Gleam could recharge it quickly. He had told her to gather her mana and prepare a powerful spell. Mages could make spells stronger by chanting longer and steadily adding more mana to them. Rusty had learned of this trick's existence since coming to the city, and now he wanted to see just how powerful Gleam's mana bolt could get. Instead of targeting the advancing monsters, Gleam aimed her spell at the ceiling near the chamber entrance. Her antennae glowed with a fierce blue light as she gathered mana, forming a pulsating orb of energy above her head. With a deep breath, she braced her tiny form, aimed, and launched the spell. The force of the recoil was too much for her small ant body, and she was flung back against a nearby wall. Fortunately, Rusty was ready as he quickly scooped her up onto his shoulder, and together, they began their escape. The mana bolt surged forward, crackling as it collided with the stone ceiling, erupting in a flash of light and sound that shook the entire chamber. With a thunderous boom, the ceiling above the cultists shattered, sending massive chunks of stone crashing down. Dust and debris filled the air, obscuring their enemies from view, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. When the dust began to settle, Rusty could see that several of the transformed cultists had been crushed or pinned beneath the heavy stones. Their twisted, bloodshot eyes glared up at him, still filled with a frenzied hatred even as they struggled to free themselves from the rubble. The high priest, unharmed and standing behind the fallen stones, looked up, his expression no longer calm and composed. His eyes narrowed, clearly annoyed by the disruption, but he quickly raised his staff, a surge of crimson energy gathering at its tip. He was preparing another spell, one that the group on the other side wasn't willing to wait for. "Back, we need to go back." This time it was Layla who shouted in panic, fear tightening her voice as she pulled Rusty back with her. Rusty glanced at the high priest one last time, realizing they'd bought themselves only seconds. The priest's crimson energy gathered and crackled ominously, casting blood-red shadows along the walls. However, between them and the high priest stood that man Rusty had saved, his eyes unwavering. "There you are, you damn bastard, I will tear you apart." Rusty wasn't entirely sure what was happening, as he knew it was possible to fall back to the stairs and use the narrow entrance as a defense. If they could even try to collapse the doorway behind them to buy more time. Yet, for some reason, the man beside them refused to retreat. Instead, he charged at the high priest, hurling the iron axe Rusty had crafted just as the priest was about to finish his spell. Instead of trying to retreat, the man decided to face the man alone. "This is our chance, Rusty. We have to flee." A burden called to him. Rusty took one last look at the berserker before turning away, ready to make his escape. Both he and Layla sprinted without looking back. He wasn't sure what the man was doing, but it didn't seem to be a noble sacrifice but instead a grudge he had with that high priest. Layla's breathing was ragged beside him, she didn't seem to have much more stamina left, something he didn't need to worry about. Gleam clung tightly to Rusty's shoulder, her silvery exoskeleton still faintly glowing from the magic she'd just unleashed, though her energy reserves were clearly low. Rusty could feel her tiny body tremble against his neck, exhausted but still alert, antennae twitching as if sensing the danger that loomed just behind them. They reached the stairway just as the final blocks locked into place, a soft glow signaling that the mechanism had completed its cycle. Many of the prisoners were already partway up the stairs, having climbed in desperation even before they were fully formed. Now, with the high priest having turned every cultist into a bloodthirsty beast, panic was setting in, and they scrambled upward in sheer terror. "Up, quickly!" Rusty urged the injured forward, pushing them up the steps. Layla assisted as well, steadying the weaker prisoners as they limped upward. He didn't really care to aid anyone as he wasn't even part of any of their races. If his true form was discovered, it was more than possible that these people would treat him as if he were part of those cultists. In truth, his only real friend here was Gleam, and his primary goal was reaching the top. "Mr. Albert, there are probably going to be some guards waiting up ahead, I'll leave them to you." It seemed that his temporary acquaintance Layla misinterpreted his actions, but his only care was to get up and finally, escape this predicament together with Gleam. "Understood." Rusty replied with a curt nod, though he had no idea how he'd handle any guards waiting above. His skills were best suited to dark, confined spaces, not open battlegrounds where he'd likely be outnumbered. But he had little choice and moved forward, though a strange feeling of conflict nagged at him. The smart move would be to leave these people behind, use them as shields against the guards, and make his escape. He didn't owe them anything, and he certainly didn't expect any of them to risk their lives for his. His metallic steps echoed against the rocky stairs that wound in a spiraling ascent. The injured people clung to the side walls, allowing him to move quickly through the middle. When he glanced up, he could see a faint light shining through, and it appeared that the cultist guards stationed above had been alerted to their presence. Ahead, he spotted one of the former prisoners, now armed with one of his weapons, charging forward with a few others following close behind. "That's the exit. I'm almost there, but what now?" He was nearly free, Gleam perched alertly on his shoulder. The exit to this underground lair of madmen lay just ahead, just a few more steps, and he'd be free. But would it really end so easily? He was unsure, but either way, today he and his friend would be free and would be able to face this strange word together.